A kingdom no larger than a whisper dared to outshout the world. Hemmed by mountains, bound by sea, Portugal was not born to power. It carved it from wind and faith. What began as survival became revelation. Warriors turned to sailors. Prayer became compass. The horizon, a promise. Each voyage redrew the edge of the possible. Each discovery a confession written on salt. From Lisbon's quays to the ends of the earth, its caravels carried both gospel and greed. The smallest realm of Europe would teach the world how ambition sails faster than empire and endures longer than maps. Before Portugal had a name, it was dreamed. Long before kings drew borders or ships found horizons, there was only the vision of a land that might one day belong to itself. Between the green hills of the Minho and the restless mouth of the Tagus, small fortresses clung to stone ridges like prayers turned to granite. Smoke rose from villages rebuilt on the ruins of forgotten empires, and the cross stood where the crescent had fallen, though neither faith nor conquest ever truly slept. Out of that shifting borderland, half Christian, half Moorish, wholly alive, something began to take shape, fragile as dawn, enduring as the rock beneath it. Afonso Enriquez was born into that dream, heir not to peace, but to a purpose still being written in dust and blood. His childhood unfolded among soldiers who spoke of God as if he were a neighbor and of war as if it were harvest. The court at Guimarães was no palace, only timber walls, cold stone, and banners worn thin by the wind. But within those walls, an idea stirred. Each raid across the mountains, each chapel rebuilt from ruin, each field ploughed closer to enemy ground, added flesh to that invisible nation. It was not yet called Portugal, but its pulse could already be heard in the clang of iron and the whisper of prayers for victory. The 12th century dawned on a restless Iberia. To the east, Leon and Castile feuded like brothers fighting over inheritance. To the south, the emirs of Al-Andalus held lands rich in silk and science, their cities gleaming under minarets that caught the light like spears. Between these worlds lay a narrow strip of frontier, small, stubborn, and determined not to vanish. Count Henry of Burgundy had come from distant France to serve in Iberia's holy wars, rewarded with this harsh territory for his valor. Yet it would be his son, Afonso, who would turn the grant of a frontier into the birthright of a kingdom. He learned early that survival depended less on loyalty than on will. The boy watched his mother, Teresa, rule in her husband's absence, balancing between Leon's demands and the ambitions of local lords. Guimarães was surrounded by men who pledged faith one day and rebellion the next. Afonso grew among them like iron in a forge, hammered, tempered, unbending. When he came of age, he defied even his mother, gathering vassals who saw in him a clarity that others mistook for arrogance. The clash at São Mamede in 1128 was not just a battle between armies, but between two visions of power, one that bent toward Leon and one that refused to bow at all. Afonso's victory there did more than secure his rule. It gave shape to the dream that the people of this land could be their own masters. From the fields of Urique to the walls of Santarém, his campaigns turned faith into weapon and geography into destiny. The land he claimed was poor, its villages small and scattered, its people hardened by hunger and hope alike. Yet they followed him southward, through dust and thorn, because he offered something no foreign lord had ever promised: ownership of the soil they bled for. Each fortress he took became a new heartbeat in the young realm. At Urique, legend said the sun stood still as victory crowned his cause. In the stillness after battle, surrounded by men whose faith had carried them beyond reason, Afonso declared himself not just count, but king. The coronation was as much prophecy as proclamation, whispered in Latin prayers and shouted in Portuguese voices that were still learning their own sound. Lisbon fell decades later, its towers bristling against the horizon like the teeth of a locked gate. The siege lasted through months of heat and famine, foreign crusaders fighting beside local knights, sailors pulling stones from the ramparts with ropes and faith. When the walls finally cracked and the gates gave way, the Tagus filled with the reflection of banners fluttering in sunlight. It was more than victory. It was the moment the kingdom turned its face fully toward the sea. From the ashes of conquest rose a new capital, its harbour crowded with masts and markets that smelled of salt, spices, and ambition. The river carried everything the land could not grow: grain from Andalusia, cloth from Flanders, hope from distant shores, and returned with whispers of what might lie beyond the horizon. In the north, monasteries multiplied where fortresses had stood. The Cistercians carved terraces into barren hills, coaxing wheat from dust and vines from stone. They wrote records where once there had been only rumour and chant, teaching nobles the weight of law and kings the reach of writing. Under their quiet discipline, the country began to breathe. Roads that had been tracks for soldiers became paths for merchants. Bridges replaced fords where caravans could pass in safety. In the markets of Coimbra and Santarém, merchants bartered in half a dozen tongues, their coins clinking against relics and rosaries. The Reconquista shaped the rhythm of life as surely as the tides shaped the coast. Every harvest risked loss to raid or drought. Every prayer carried both gratitude and plea. The church blessed each campaign as crusade, promising salvation for blood spilled in holy cause. Yet beneath that sacred veneer, ambition worked in silence. Land meant power, and power meant independence. As Moorish strongholds fell, their orchards and fields passed into Christian hands, creating a new nobility bound more by possession than piety. The kingdom stretched southward like a shadow following the sun, its borders shifting with each season's war. Kingship in Portugal was never a gift of peace, but an act of persistence. Afonso's heirs inherited a throne without wealth and a country without rest. Sancho I continued his father's work, fortifying towns that had barely recovered from conquest, planting settlers in valleys emptied by war. His soldiers built walls faster than they could bury their dead, but each stone, layered, was another word in the language of endurance. Coimbra rose as the beating heart of this new Portugal, a city of stone bridges and narrow lanes where Latin priests and Moorish artisans lived within the same walls, bound not by creed but by necessity. The land itself shaped its people. To the east lay mountains too steep for cavalry, to the south plains too open for safety, to the west an ocean that promised everything and revealed nothing. Isolation bred self-reliance, and hardship bred ingenuity. Farmers learned to wrest grain from unkind soil. Sailors studied the moods of tides that seemed to lead nowhere. Their tools were simple, their faith stubborn, their gaze always drawn toward the horizon. The sea became a mirror in which the kingdom saw both its limits and its future. As the 13th century turned, the work of conquest gave way to the labor of consolidation. Kings who once rode from fortress to fortress now governed from courts that began to resemble permanence. The Charter of Leiria, the laws of Lisbon, the councils of Coimbra, all wove order into what had once been improvisation. In these halls of stone, scribes copied decrees in careful Latin, but beyond the parchment, another tongue was taking hold. Portuguese, born from Latin, and shaped by the cries of soldiers and the songs of farmers, began to speak for itself. The dream was finding its voice. With peace came another kind of struggle, the contest between the sword and the crozier. The church had guided the realm's birth. Now it sought to share its power. Bishops demanded privileges, monasteries claimed land, and papal envoys reminded kings that crowns were not beyond heaven's reach. Yet Portugal's rulers had learned their craft in war, not obedience. Afonso II faced excommunication rather than surrender authority to Rome, his stubbornness earning both condemnation and eventually respect. His defiance drew a boundary invisible on any map, between a kingdom of believers and a nation of free will. Under Sancho II and Afonso III, the realm reached its natural form. The southern campaign against the Moors brought Algarve into the fold, the final jewel in a crown forged through 2 centuries of struggle. When Pharaoh's gates opened in 1249, Portugal's frontiers were fixed more by destiny than by design. The same mountains, rivers, and sea that define them still. The wars had ended, but something older had begun. Lisbon, reborn from conquest, filled with the noise of shipyards and markets. Carpenters worked beside Moorish craftsmen, whose faith survived beneath the tolerance of necessity. Sailors carried wine down the Tagus to trade for northern cloth, returning with foreign words that mingled with their own. The city smelled of pitch, salt, and promise. Stone by stone, it turned from fortress into port, from boundary into beginning. By the mid-13th century, the dream that had stirred in Guimarães was no longer an echo. It was a pulse that reached every shore. A people once scattered across valleys and castles now spoke a common name. Their kings bore crowns recognized by Rome. Their laws bound cities that had once defied every lord. Yet even in stability, restlessness endured. The same hunger that had driven Afonso to defy Leon, that had sent knights south across the Tagus, now turned westward. The wars of the land were over. The wars of the sea had not yet begun. On quiet evenings, when the winds fell still over the Atlantic, fishermen spoke of waters that had no end. They did not yet know that their children's children would follow those waves beyond the world they could imagine. But something in the air had changed. The kingdom had been carved from faith and iron. Now it awaited a new kind of conquest, one of wind, wood, and will. Portugal was no longer a dream. It was awake, restless, and standing at the edge of a horizon it was born to cross. By the mid-13th century, Portugal stood whole for the first time. From the green valleys of Minho to the sun-bleached coves of the Algarve, the kingdom at last held the borders that would define it for centuries. The wars of faith had ended. Silence returned to fields once watered with blood. Fortresses became towns, swords became plowshares, and men who had lived by conquest learned the slower rhythm of peace. Yet behind that calm, another hunger stirred. A realm born of struggle could not rest without purpose. Afonso III, last of the conquerors, became the first true administrator. He summoned nobles, clergy, and burghers to his courtiers at Leiria, asking them not for loyalty, but for counsel. Out of their quarrels grew a habit of governance rare in medieval Europe, a dialogue between crown and people that would, in time, give the small kingdom a strength larger realms lacked. In chancery halls, scribes set this new order to parchment in the language of the land itself. Portuguese, once only spoken, now flowed in ink beside Latin, turning the speech of shepherds and soldiers into the instrument of kings. Trade followed language. Along the Tagus, Lisbon rebuilt its quays into forests of masts. English and Flemish merchants filled the harbour with bales of cloth and barrels of salt fish. In return, ships departed heavy with wine, oil, and leather. Genoese captains charted the winds. Jewish financiers kept the ledgers balanced. What had been a fortress now pulsed as a port, its markets a babel of tongues beneath the same church bells that once tolled for war. The nobility, deprived of conquest, sought meaning in pageantry. Their banners fluttered above processions rather than battlefields, and tournaments replaced campaigns. Knights who had inherited valor but not purpose turned their restlessness into spectacle, while the true labor of the realm shifted to merchants and artisans. Only in monasteries did the old discipline endure. The Cistercians drained swamps, terraced hillsides, and taught peasants to work as if toil itself were a prayer. Their quiet industry turned wilderness into harvest and faith into infrastructure. Then came famine, and worse. In the 14th century, plague swept through the narrow lanes of Lisbon and Porto, leaving silence where there had been song. Half the kingdom perished, but what survived was tempered. With labor scarce, towns won new freedoms, and craftsmen demanded pay, once given only gratitude. Guilds formed, councils grew, and a merchant class began to look outward, to the ships in the harbour and the line where sea met sky. Beyond recovery lay renewal. The Portuguese had lived for generations with death as neighbour. Now they turned survival into ambition. Fishermen pushed farther from shore, following cod into northern waters. They returned with stories of currents and winds unknown to ancient charts, and though few believed them, one man listened. King Ferdinand's death in 1383 ended the first royal line and threatened the independence for which so many had fought. Castile claimed both throne and country through marriage, sending armies to enforce its right. But the people who had forged their nation from defiance refused surrender. From that chaos rose João, master of the Order of Aviz, an illegitimate prince whose authority came not from blood but from resolve. In 1385, on the fields of Aljubarrota, his outnumbered army shattered the invaders and secured a dynasty born of merit. The victory did more than preserve sovereignty. It reignited purpose. The Aviz kings inherited a nation poor in gold but rich in certainty. João I rebuilt the fleet and the confidence of his people. Shipyards in Lisbon rang with hammers, their rhythm like a hymn. The city swelled with merchants and scholars drawn from Italy, Aragon, and Flanders. The sea became not a boundary, but an apprenticeship. Among the king's sons grew one whose imagination reached farther than any wall could hold. Henry, called later the Navigator, walked the docks as a child, tracing lines in salt on the planks and asking sailors where the sun went when it sank into the west. He was educated in theology and mathematics, but what stirred him most were the charts of the world's edge, the empty spaces marked only by monsters and fog. To him, they looked less like warnings than invitations. While Europe tore itself apart in dynastic wars, Portugal remained compact and intact. Its size became its strength. Decisions could be made swiftly, ships outfitted in months rather than years. The court at Lisbon turned practical curiosity into policy. Italian cartographers brought their instruments. Jewish astronomers refined tables of the stars. Craftsmen experimented with hulls and sails until a new vessel emerged. The caravel, light enough for exploration, strong enough for return. The church lent its blessing through the Order of Christ, heir to the Templars' fortune and fervour. Its knights no longer rode to Jerusalem, but prayed over compasses and astrolabes. They saw in the ocean a field of faith awaiting cultivation. Their red cross, once raised on shields, now adorned sails that would carry Portugal into history. Lisbon changed again. At dawn, the river glimmered with the light of hundreds of masts. By dusk, the city smelled of pitch, rope, and brine. Mariners' taverns filled with talk of islands glimpsed beyond Madeira, of dark-skinned traders across the western sea, of gold that could be reached if one dared the wind. Even the poorest labourer sensed that something vast was awakening, that the kingdom which had once fought to exist was preparing to discover its purpose. In 1415, that purpose found its first test. Ceuta, the walled city that guarded the Strait of Gibraltar, was rich in silks, spices, and rumour. To seize it was to claim a gateway to Africa's trade and the legend of gold beyond the desert. The plan was born in Henry's restless mind, but it bore his father's blessing. That summer, the Tagus filled with ships, a floating army drawn from every port in the realm. Priests blessed the banners. Citizens lined the cliffs to watch their departure. At sunrise on August 21st, sails blazed white against the sky as the fleet crossed into waters that no Portuguese armada had yet dared. On deck, Henry stood beside his brothers, the wind tugging at his cloak, the scent of salt and prophecy in the air. Behind them lay a kingdom barely 2 centuries old. Ahead, a world waiting to be measured. The drums beat, the anchors lifted, and the ships turned south toward a horizon that shimmered like a promise. Portugal's long awakening had reached its threshold. The same faith that had carried warriors across plains now filled sails. The same courage that had defended borders now sought them elsewhere. What began as a dream of land was becoming a dream of the sea. The kingdom that once fought to be free was ready to discover how far freedom could go. The morning mist hung low over the Atlantic when the fleet returned. Its hulls were battered, its sails torn, but the banners of Portugal fluttered above them, red crosses bright against the pale light. Ceuta had fallen. The echo of its cannon fire still lingered in memory, the thunder that had announced Portugal's arrival beyond Europe. What had begun as a crusade had ended as an awakening. When the soldiers came home, they carried more than loot from Africa's shore. They brought stories of gold dust traded by dark-skinned merchants, of caravans that crossed endless deserts, of lands where the sun seemed to rise larger and closer to God. In the royal court, those stories found an eager listener. Prince Henry, third son of King Guillaume I and Queen Philippa of Lancaster, had fought at Ceuta beside his brothers. He had seen the African coast glimmer beneath a merciless sun, and something within him refused to turn back. While the rest of the army returned to celebration, he stayed to command the new fortress and learn its rhythms. Ceuta was less a triumph than a question, one that would shape the rest of his life. Why risk everything to cross the sea, only to stop at its edge? The city's markets provided an answer in whispers. From the south came merchants leading camels burdened with gold, ivory, and pepper. They spoke of kingdoms far beyond the dunes, Mali, where rulers weighed gold like grain, and Benin, whose artisans carved ivory as white as bone. Yet all this wealth reached Ceuta by land, controlled by Muslim traders who guarded the desert routes like veins of empire. To break that monopoly, Henry reasoned, Portugal must find another path to the source, a way by sea around the continent itself. When his father recalled him to Lisbon, Henry obeyed, but his thoughts never left the African coast. He withdrew to the wind-swept promontory of Sagres in the Algarve, where cliffs fell sheer into the Atlantic and the horizon stretched unbroken. There he built not a palace, but a laboratory of dreams. Sailors, map-makers, astronomers, and craftsmen gathered under his patronage. No single structure could contain them. There was no grand school of navigation, as later legend imagined, But there was a spirit of collaboration that turned curiosity into science. Around wooden tables strewn with compasses and sea charts, men traced the shape of a world that no one yet fully believed existed. The ocean that faced them was still a thing of fear. Mariners called it the Mar Tenebroso, the Sea of Darkness, where monstrous waves devoured ships and winds blew forever westward, never returning. Yet Henry's captains, driven by his stubborn faith, began to test those waters one voyage at a time. They hugged the African coast, measuring its curve like a sculptor feeling the edge of a statue. Each cape rounded became a victory, not of conquest, but of comprehension. The first breakthrough came by accident. In 1419, a storm swept a small expedition far from sight of land. When the skies cleared, the sailors found themselves before a green island rising from the mist. It was Madeira, rich in forests and rain, a paradise dropped in the ocean. Henry claimed it at once for the crown, sending settlers to build villages and burn the woods for fields. Timber from its mountains would soon rebuild Portugal's fleet, and sugarcane from Sicily would find its new home in its volcanic soil. The experiment worked so well that within decades, Madeira's mills churned out more sugar than any other land in Christendom, their profits feeding new voyages. Encouraged, Henry looked farther west. In 1427, explorers reached the Azores, another archipelago scattered like stepping stones across the Atlantic. Their discovery stretched the boundaries of the known world and hinted at others still unseen. From these islands, sailors learned the patterns of wind and current that would one day carry caravels to continents still unknown. But Henry's true obsession lay to the south. Each year, his captains ventured farther down the African coast, charting rivers, headlands, and strange peoples. They learned to ride the Atlantic winds in zigzag courses, outward with the northeasterlies, homeward with the western breezes. Their ships returned with salt, fish, and a handful of captives taken in skirmishes. Among these first slaves, the court saw both horror and opportunity. The church sanctified the trade as a weapon against paganism, granting indulgences to those who converted the captured. Within a generation, the traffic would grow from experiment to institution. In 1434, one barrier fell that had haunted sailors for centuries. The Cape Boyador jutted into the ocean like the end of the world, its currents fierce, its reefs hidden. For generations, seamen swore that beyond it, the sea boiled, and no wind blew home. Then Gilleans, a minor nobleman in Henry's service, volunteered to challenge the superstition. His first attempt failed. His men mutinied. The next year he tried again, steering his caravel wide into open water. When he returned, he carried not gold or spices, but a sprig of wild roses from the far side of the cape. It was enough. The spell of fear was broken. The ocean, Henry declared, was God's creation and therefore knowable. After Bojador, progress quickened. Caravels became the kingdom's chariots of discovery, light, swift, and strong enough to sail against the wind. With their lateen sails and shallow drafts, they could explore estuaries where deep-hulled ships dared not go. Year by year, Portuguese banners appeared farther down the map: Arguin, Senegal, Cape Verde. At each new anchorage, Henry's captains erected stone pillars, padroins, crowned with crosses, declaring the land taken in the name of Christ and King. Trade replaced conquest as Portugal's weapon. From Arguin came gold dust, from Guinea pepper that Europeans mistook for spice from the east. The profits enriched the crown and silenced those who had mocked Henry's obsessions as folly. Lisbon's mint struck new gold coins, the cruzados. their name a reminder that faith and commerce had become indistinguishable. Yet not all wealth came clean. Along with gold and ivory came men and women sold into bondage. In 1444, a single fleet returned to the Algarve with hundreds of captives, their chains clattering on the quays of Lagos as merchants bid for human lives. Chroniclers described the scene with awe rather than pity, seeing in it the fulfillment of prophecy. Pagans brought from darkness to light. History would remember it differently. By the 1450s, Portuguese ships had traced the bulge of West Africa, naming the rivers Senegal and Gambia, mapping capes and islands along the way. They learned the patterns of the Atlantic gyres and the seasonal pulse of the monsoon winds. Where earlier voyages had sought miracle and legend, these pursued knowledge. Charts once blank began to fill with coastlines that stretched farther than imagination had dared. Not all voyages prospered. Some vanished in storms. Others returned empty, their crews thinned by fever. The sea demanded lives as tribute for each secret it revealed. Yet Henry pressed on. He measured success not by treasure, but by distance, by the gradual erosion of ignorance. His captains, once fearful of shadows, now spoke in degrees of latitude and days of sail. For the first time, the ocean had coordinates. In 1455, the papacy granted Portugal exclusive rights over all lands discovered beyond Cape Bojador, framing exploration as crusade and monopoly alike. The same cross that had crowned Lisbon's churches now marked the borders of an empire still unborn. Henry received the news at Sagres with solemn satisfaction. He had no heir to inherit his titles, but he had found another form of legacy. To explore was to serve God. To map the world was to praise its maker. The prince's later years unfolded in the rhythm of the tides he had spent a lifetime studying. His agents established the first permanent trading posts along the African coast, fortified stations where goods and captives changed hands. Timber from Madeira built the ships that supplied them. Sugar financed their defense. The pattern of empire was already visible. A chain of ports stretching across oceans, each a spark of Portugal's reach. By the time of his death in 1460, Henry had never commanded a fleet, nor set foot beyond the familiar coasts, yet his vision had altered the course of history. In the decades of his patronage, Portuguese sailors had extended the known world by thousands of miles, proving that the Atlantic was not a barrier, but a bridge. His tomb at Batalha lay beneath arches carved with stars, perhaps fitting for the man who had taught his country to navigate by them. After Henry's passing, the work did not cease. His nephew, King Afonso V, inherited both the fleets and the fever of expansion. Under his rule, captains like Diogo Gomes and Álvaro Fernandes pushed beyond the equator, venturing into regions where the constellations themselves changed. They found new islands, Sierra Leone, Cape Verde, and new peoples who spoke tongues that no European could yet understand. For every map they brought back, 10 new questions appeared. Portugal had begun its story as a frontier kingdom, forged in wars of faith. Under Henry, it had become a frontier of knowledge, where faith and reason sailed under the same flag. The crusader's sword had become the navigator's compass, the battlefield, the sea. What had once been a dream of independence was transforming into a vision of discovery. On the shores of the Tagus, Lisbon thrived like a city touched by prophecy. The warehouses filled with gold dust, ivory, and sugar. The air rang with languages from across the known world. Each returning ship brought proof that the earth was larger, and Portugal's role within it greater than anyone had dared believe. The horizon that had once marked the end of the world was now the beginning of its future. The age of exploration had begun, and the smallest of Europe's kingdoms was leading it. When Prince Henry died in 1460, the ocean did not grow silent. His vision lingered like a tide that refused to turn, pulling the kingdom ever outward. The stone towers of Sagres watched over an empty horizon, but from Lisbon to Lagos, shipwrights kept their hammers ringing. The caravels he had perfected were no longer experiments but instruments of policy. Portugal's gaze, once fixed on Africa's deserts, now followed the curve of its coasts deep into the unknown. King Afonso V inherited this momentum and turned it into ambition. The monarch was young, restless, and surrounded by captains who had learned their craft under Henry's discipline. Each spring, fleets sailed south along the African littoral, returning with gold, slaves, and stories of lands that seemed to multiply with each voyage. In Lisbon, the royal treasury filled with dusted coins stamped from new bullion, while merchants argued over cargoes of ivory and hides. The discoveries no longer needed defense. They justified themselves. Under Afonso's reign, the empire began to take shape, not as territory, but as a network. Stone fortresses rose on distant shores, where Portuguese banners caught the wind beside minarets and palms. Arguin became the first true outpost of the Atlantic Age, its harbour crowded with Moorish traders, African middlemen, and European sailors. There, gold from the Niger's bend and slaves from the interior changed hands under the watchful eye of royal factors. The profits were small compared to what later centuries would bring, but their meaning was immense. Portugal had learned how to rule from afar. The discoveries advanced in small leaps, each voyage extending the map by inches, each headland a victory over ignorance. Diogo Gomes pushed beyond the Gambia River, sketching its serpentine, course and naming capes that no European had seen before. Cadamosto, a Venetian in Portuguese service, followed, describing the people of the coast with the curiosity of a merchant and the prejudice of his age. His journals spoke of kingdoms governed by justice, of markets filled with ivory and pepper, of rulers who demanded tribute of silk and steel rather than submission. To the Portuguese crown, such accounts meant only one thing: opportunity. By the 1470s, the rhythm of discovery had become the heartbeat of the nation. Every summer, caravels slipped south from the Tagus, their sails catching the same winds that would one day carry Vasco da Gama to India. Each autumn they returned with new coordinates, their charts more accurate, their holds heavier. They brought back also the dead, men claimed by fever or shipwreck, but even that toll could not still the hunger for distance. In 1471, a fleet commanded by Fernão Gomes reached what would become known as the Gold Coast. There, for the first time, Portuguese sailors saw the source of the riches that had lured them across a century of ocean. On the beaches of Elmina, gold gleamed in river sand. Merchants weighed it in balance scales before melting it into ingots that would shine in Lisbon's markets. Gomes was granted monopoly rights over the region in exchange for annual discoveries, a contract that turned exploration into enterprise. He exceeded every promise, tracing the coastline farther south with each expedition, blending royal glory with private profit. The following decade transformed speculation into empire. Diogo Cao, a quiet nobleman of keen precision, was chosen to continue the work. In 1482, he sailed beyond the known world, passing the mouth of the mighty Congo River. Its waters poured into the sea with the force of a continent, and Cao followed them inland, greeted by kingdoms whose rulers wore European cloth bought through generations of indirect trade. He raised stone pillars, padroins, engraved with the arms of Portugal, symbols not of conquest, but of claim. Each stood as a declaration that the world's edges now bore a Portuguese name. When Cao returned to Lisbon, he was hailed as a hero, and sent out again almost at once. His second voyage carried him past the Namib's red sands to the barren cliffs of Cape Cross. The desert stretched to infinity, its silence broken only by the wind, but the sight of it filled him with certainty. The African coast curved ever eastward. Somewhere beyond lay the passage to the Indies. Caen set another padrone in the rock and turned back for home, unaware that he was only a few hundred miles from the southernmost point of the continent. Back in Lisbon, the court celebrated his discoveries with feasts and prayers. Yet the question remained, how far did Africa bend, and where did it end? The old maps, descendants of Ptolemy's imagination, still pictured the Indian Ocean as a closed sea surrounded by land. If the continent could be circled, it would rewrite not only geography, but the foundations of trade itself. The king who achieved that would command the path to spices, silk, and gold. He would be richer than any ruler in Christendom. In 1481, Afonso's death brought his son João II to the throne, a monarch of intellect sharper than any sword. He was called O Príncipe Perfeito, the perfect prince, for he combined the boldness of a soldier with the patience of a mathematician. Where his father had dreamed of crusades, João dreamed of precision, maps without errors, voyages without guesswork, empire without chaos. He reorganized exploration as statecraft, gathering the kingdom's best pilots into a single office. Every discovery was recorded, every coordinate guarded as a national secret. João understood that mastery of the sea required mastery of information. He revived the work of Henry's scholars, ordering astronomical tables updated and compasses standardized. He spoke to his captains not as nobles, but as instruments of knowledge. "Sail south," he told them, "until the stars change." And they obeyed. Among those who answered his call was a quiet man named Bartolomeu Dias. Of noble but modest birth, Dias had served as a pilot under Cao, and inherited both his charts and his determination. In 1487, the king entrusted him with 3 ships and a mission that sounded like madness: to find, if it existed, the sea route around Africa to the Indies. He departed Lisbon in the summer of that year, his fleet carrying food for months, stone padrones for claiming new lands, and a handful of Africans trained to serve as interpreters. The voyage began as all others had: slow progress along familiar coasts, barter for supplies, the routine of measurements and wind. But as they passed the last known landmark, Cape Cross, the ocean turned hostile. Winds screamed from the south, currents fought their rudders, and storms drove them far from shore. For weeks they drifted in grey water under a sunless sky. When the gales finally calmed, Dias found himself in open sea, lost but unbroken. Trusting the currents, he steered east. Days later, his lookouts sighted land, mountains faint through mist. They had rounded the tip of Africa without knowing it. The coast now ran northeast, the water warm, the winds different. Dias had found the passage. He followed it as far as Algoa Bay before his men, exhausted and terrified, begged to turn back. He relented, marking the furthest point with a stone pillar and naming it the Cape of Storms. On the return journey, the truth of his discovery struck him with the weight of revelation. The African continent had an end. Beyond it lay the open path to India. When he reached Lisbon in late 1488, the court received him as one risen from the dead. The king, reading his reports, renamed the headland the Cape of Good Hope. For now, the way to the Indies was open, and with it the promise of an empire unlike any the world had known. Dias had sailed nearly 16,000 miles in a voyage of 20 months. And though he had not reached the spice ports of legend, he had accomplished something greater. He had connected 2 oceans. His return changed everything. The dreams of Henry the Navigator were vindicated, the prophecies of João II fulfilled. Portugal, smallest of Europe's realms, had discovered the measure of the world. In the shipyards of Lisbon, preparations began at once for the next step. New vessels were designed for endurance, their hulls strengthened, their masts taller. Astronomers recalculated routes, mapmakers redrew the globe. The sound of saws and hammers filled the air as if the whole city were preparing to sail. Within a decade, another expedition would depart, led by a man named Vasco da Gama, to complete what Dias had begun. But that is another chapter. For now, the horizon that once ended at Bojador stretched unbroken to the farthest seas. The Atlantic, once feared as the sea of darkness, had become the highway of light. From the cliffs of Sagres to the markets of Lisbon, the kingdom stood at the edge of revelation. The world had grown larger, and Portugal, for the first time, was at its center. By the last decade of the 15th century, the world was unfolding faster than anyone could comprehend. In the span of a single generation, Portugal had turned the edge of myth into the edge of empire. The Cape of Good Hope, once a whisper of terror, was now a mark on royal maps. The ocean that had once devoured ships had become a corridor of faith and ambition. Lisbon, once a quiet harbor of fishermen and monks, pulsed like the heart of a new world economy. Every spring, its quays groaned under the weight of ships bound south, their sails painted with the red cross of the Order of Christ, their holds stuffed with iron, wine, and prayer. King João II ruled this transformation with the mind of a mathematician and the patience of a priest. He had sent Bartolomeu Dias into darkness and received him back with the light of proof. But before the monarch could complete his design, death took him in 1495, leaving his cousin and successor, Manuel, to inherit not merely a kingdom but a vision. Manuel, young and radiant, saw himself as God's chosen ruler, a man anointed to lead Christendom into its golden age. The nobles called him O Venturoso, the fortunate, and he believed it. To Manuel, the voyage to India was no longer an experiment. It was destiny. Spices had become more than luxury. They were power. Whoever reached their source would control the arteries of global trade, drawing the wealth of the Indies into Christian hands. For that, he needed a commander of both courage and calculation, one who would follow the line Henry the Navigator had drawn all the way to its end. The man chosen was Vasco da Gama. Da Gama was not a courtier, nor of noble grace. He came from Sines, a small port where the Atlantic winds sculpted the very bones of its people. He was a sailor by birth and temperament, stern, taciturn, and unflinching. He had served in the royal fleet, learned the habits of tide and wind, and earned a reputation for discipline so rigid that even storms seemed to respect it. When the summons came from Lisbon, he accepted it without question, as though he had been waiting his whole life for this command. On a July morning in 1497, the Tagus glittered with ceremony. 4 ships stood ready, the São Gabriel, São Rafael, Berrio, and a supply vessel heavy with provisions. Priests blessed the crews, trumpets echoed from the hills. King Manuel himself watched from the terraces of Belém as the fleet drifted downstream, banners streaming like tongues of flame. On every sail shone the crimson cross, and on every deck men whispered the same prayer: Deus nos guia, God guide us. The fleet followed the path of Bartolomeu Dias, rounding the Cape Verde Islands and then striking westward into open ocean. For 3 months, they saw nothing but sky and water. The Atlantic swallowed their sense of direction, but the pilots trusted the winds Henry's captains had charted decades before. The men suffered from thirst and scurvy. Their gums bled, their teeth loosened, and their dreams filled with the taste of oranges. When despair was thickest, seabirds appeared, and then the coast of Africa, low, red, and shimmering, rose from the horizon. At St. Helena Bay, they anchored to repair the ships and trade with locals who approached cautiously in reed canoes. The encounters were wary, sometimes violent, for neither side understood the other's intentions. But Da Gama pressed onward, doubling the Cape of Good Hope in December. The fleet struggled against contrary winds until February, when the coast turned north and the water warmed, the unmistakable sign that they had passed into another ocean. In March, the ships entered a vast river mouth. Hippopotamuses wallowed in the shallows. Crocodiles glided like shadows. The men called it the River of Good Signs, but history would know it as the Zambezi. There they rested, repaired the rigging, and planted a stone pillar on the shore. Beyond this river, Da Gama knew, lay lands that traded with Arabia and India. He could sense the threshold of a different world. Sailing north, they reached Mozambique, a city of coral houses and minarets, a Muslim port rich with merchants from across the Indian Ocean. The Sultan received them with courtesy but suspicion, mistaking them for Turkish traders until their ignorance of Arabic betrayed them. Gifts were exchanged: coral beads, brass basins, crimson cloth. Yet when the locals discovered that the Portuguese sought Christian alliances and trade in spices, the tone turned hostile. Da Gama barely escaped a plot to seize his ships, escaping under cannon fire that shattered the harbour's peace. Further up the coast, at Mombasa, hostility deepened. Here too the Muslim merchants feared the newcomers as rivals. The São Gabriel barely avoided destruction when native pilots led her towards submerged rocks. Da Gama retaliated with musket fire, and the fleet fled once more. They found refuge in Malindi, a rival city eager to defy its neighbours. Its ruler, seeing advantage in friendship, provided food, water, and, most precious of all, a pilot who claimed to know the monsoon route to India. The man was an Arab or Gujarati, perhaps both. His name was lost to time, but his skill was not. On April 24th, 1498, guided by his instruments and the stars, the Portuguese fleet caught the monsoon winds and turned northeast across the Indian Ocean. The voyage took 23 days. They saw no land, only the wheeling of constellations unfamiliar to European eyes. The men prayed to a god who seemed very far away. Then, one morning, the cry of "land" rang from the masthead. Ahead lay a green coastline, crowned with coconut palms and distant mountains glowing under the sun. It was the Malabar coast of India. On May 20th, the ships anchored off Calicut, one of the richest ports of the East. The smell of spice hung in the air: pepper, cinnamon, clove, sandalwood. Canoes approached, filled with traders dressed in cotton and gold, their foreheads marked with saffron. To them, the Portuguese were neither gods nor devils, only another band of merchants seeking profit. Da Gama sent envoys ashore, carrying gifts for the local ruler, the Zamorin. The first audience was bewildering. The Portuguese wore mail armour under the tropical sun, sweating before a court that gleamed with jewels. Their gifts, cloth, trinkets, coral, seemed pitiful beside the luxury of the East. Yet the Zamorin listened. He had seen traders from every corner of the ocean and understood opportunity when it presented itself. He granted them leave to trade, though his Muslim merchants seethed with jealousy. The next weeks were filled with tense negotiations, miscommunications, and intrigue. Da Gama's men sold their goods at poor prices, but they obtained what they had come for: bales of pepper, bags of cinnamon, and most importantly, the knowledge that the sea route to India was real. When the time came to depart, the monsoon had turned. The voyage home would be against the wind, through storms that tested both ship and soul. Scurvy returned with a vengeance. Bodies were cast overboard daily. The San Rafael, too damaged to continue, was burned near the African coast. Of the original 4 ships, only 2 would reach Lisbon, but they carried enough cargo to pay for the entire expedition 100 times over. After nearly 2 years at sea, da Gama returned in September 1499. Bells rang across Lisbon as the news spread. The king's court erupted in celebration, and Manuel knelt in the cathedral, thanking God for the miracle that had carried his kingdom across half the world. He named da Gama Admiral of the Indies, granted him lands and titles, and ordered new fleets prepared at once. The journey that had begun as an act of faith had become the foundation of empire. The voyage's consequences were immediate and vast. Within months, maps of the known world were redrawn. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans were now joined by a single line, the line of Portuguese dominion. Europe's great trading centers trembled. Venice, which had ruled the spice trade for centuries, saw its monopoly crumble as ships began to sail directly from Lisbon to India and back. The profits were unimaginable. A handful of pepper could buy a soldier's pay for a year, a chest of cloves the dowry of a princess. But wealth was only part of it. Religion, too, rode those same winds. The papacy hailed the discovery as divine providence. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas had already divided the world between Portugal and Spain, along a meridian west of the Azores. Now, as if by celestial confirmation, the seas east of that line belonged to Portugal, and to Portugal alone. Every voyage was a crusade, every cargo a sacrament of empire. Lisbon changed overnight. The harbour that had once served a provincial kingdom now thrummed as the capital of a global enterprise. Foreign merchants crowded its markets, and its streets filled with languages from every shore. Gold from Guinea, ivory from Benin, sugar from Madeira, and now pepper from Calicut poured into its warehouses. The city smelled of the world. Da Gama, austere and distant, watched it all with the detachment of a man who had glimpsed something greater than glory. He had seen the vastness of the Indian Ocean, the magnificence of cities richer than any in Christendom, and the fragility of men who believed the sea could be conquered. His voyage had opened a door that could never again be closed. Behind it waited both promise and peril. Portugal had found its empire not in the soil but in the water. Its future would no longer be measured in acres but in leagues, its power not in armies but in sails. The same winds that had carried da Gama to India would soon carry others farther still, to Ceylon, to Malacca, to the edge of the Pacific itself. The world was changing shape, and the hand that drew its new boundaries bore the cross of Christ and the name of Portugal. When the ships returned from India, Lisbon changed forever. The harbour that had once smelled of tar and salt now breathed pepper and cinnamon. Crowds filled the quays to see sailors whose faces were burned dark by equatorial suns, men who spoke of cities larger than kingdoms and oceans wider than faith. They carried silks from Calicut, jewels from Ceylon, and gold that caught the morning light. The first voyage had been a miracle. The second would be a statement of power. King Manuel understood what discovery meant only when the profits began to arrive. One cargo of spice was worth more than a year's taxes. What Henry the Navigator had dreamed and what Jerome II had planned now flowed into his treasury as reality. But trade required protection. The wealth of India could not depend on fragile alliances or the goodwill of merchants. Portugal would have to command the seas. In 1502, Vasco da Gama sailed again, no longer as explorer, but as enforcer. His fleet bristled with cannon. His orders were simple: impose Portuguese dominion across the Indian Ocean. The voyage began like the first, around the Cape, north to Mozambique. But this time, each harbour already bore the mark of his flag. When he reached Calicut, where his men had once begged for fair trade, he answered the city's suspicion with bombardment. Cannon thundered for 2 days, reducing the harbour to splinters and flame. The message was unmistakable. Portugal would no longer request permission. It would create it. After Calicut burned, Cochin and Cananora sought Portuguese friendship, eager to profit under foreign protection. Warehouses and fortresses rose beside palm groves, guarded by men who prayed before battle and balanced accounts after it. The Feitoria, the fortified factory, became Portugal's signature, a cross between church, fortress, and marketplace. From these strongholds, the empire began to breathe. The trade that followed transformed Europe. Ships left Lisbon every spring and returned in autumn, their holds filled with pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. Prices collapsed in Venice. Its merchants watched centuries of monopoly vanish. The smallest kingdom in Europe had rewritten the map of the world. Manuel built new palaces, paved new plazas, and ordered a monastery at Belém so magnificent that it seemed sculpted from sunlight itself, a monument to both faith and fortune. But wealth drew enemies. Egypt, its merchants ruined, allied with Venice and the Sultan of Gujarat to drive the Portuguese from the sea. To defend his new dominion, Manuel appointed Dom Francisco de Almeida as viceroy, giving him command of all forces east of the Cape. Almeida was a soldier first, administrator second, cold, efficient, and unshakable. He fortified Cochin, built a fleet, and demanded tribute from every passing vessel. In 1508, his policies were tested. A coalition fleet met the Portuguese near Chaul, killing his son and hanging the body from a yardarm. Almeida's revenge was biblical. At Diu the following year, his guns turned the Allied armada into floating fire. Thousands died. The sea itself seemed to burn. When it was over, the Indian Ocean belonged to Portugal. Yet Almeida's victory also marked his end. His ambition and cruelty alarmed Lisbon, and Manuel replaced him with a new commander, Afonso de Albuquerque, a man whose vision would define the empire's soul. Albuquerque arrived in 1508, with eyes fixed not on trade, but on geography. To control the ocean, he said, one must hold its gates. He struck first at Ormuz, the Persian Gulf's entrance, capturing the fortress that commanded every ship between Arabia and India. Then, turning east, he took Goa in 1510 after a brutal siege. The city, rich in temples and merchants, became the capital of the Estado da India, the State of India, the administrative heart of Portugal's empire. Goa was unlike anything Europe had imagined. Churches beside mosques, Latin hymns mingling with Hindu bells, Portuguese captains marrying Indian women under the gaze of both priest and idol. Albuquerque encouraged such unions, believing empire needed roots, not just garrisons. He rebuilt the city in stone, founded its cathedral, and filled its docks with ships bound for Africa, Arabia, and the Malay world. From Goa, he moved farther east, toward the fabled markets of Malacca. There, where all Asia met to trade, Chinese, Arabs, Javanese, he launched his boldest strike. In 1511, after days of savage fighting, Malacca fell. With it, Portugal controlled the main artery of the eastern seas. The narrow strait between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula became a Portuguese lake. Through it, past the trade of China, Japan, and the Spice Islands. Within 6 years, Albuquerque had forged an empire of ports instead of provinces, a chain of fortresses linking 3 oceans. Ormuz guarded the west, Goa ruled the center, Malacca held the east. Between them stretched the maritime spine of the New World Order. Every ship paid tribute, every trade route bent toward Lisbon. What Rome had ruled by legions, Portugal now ruled by sails. In Lisbon, the tide of wealth became a flood. Pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon arrived by the ton. Markets overflowed, coiners melted gold by the cauldron, and nobles wore India on their sleeves. The court itself became a theatre of empire, filled with foreign envoys, exotic animals, and artifacts from lands that until recently had existed only in myth. Portuguese coins jingled in Cairo and Venice, proof that power had shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. But even glory devoured its makers. The ocean demanded constant sacrifice. Ships lost to storms, crews to disease, governors to intrigue. Albuquerque himself died at sea in 1515, worn by battle and bitterness. He had been denied the honors he deserved, recalled in jealousy and abandoned in illness. His final words to his men were simple: "I leave the kingdom in your hands. May you keep it better than I." They buried him in Goa, the city he had wrested from the earth and sea, beneath walls that still smelled of gunpowder. By then, the empire he had built stretched farther than any realm before it. From the Straits of Hormuz to the Straits of Malacca, Portuguese ships ruled the horizon. The church sent friars to follow the merchants. The flag of the cross flew over mosques and pagodas. Each fortress was a sermon in stone. The dream that had begun in Guimarães under Afonso Henriques, the dream of a people forging destiny from faith, had reached its farthest shore. The warriors of the Reconquista had become mariners. The kingdom of 1,000 valleys had become an oceanic empire. Portugal, smallest of Europe's crowns, now carried half the world upon its sails. When news of Albuquerque's death reached Lisbon, bells tolled not for loss, but for fulfillment. The age of discovery had found its empire. The red cross that once marked crusaders' shields now circled the globe on white canvas. In a single lifetime, a nation that began as a dream of independence had become the architect of a connected world. At the dawn of the 16th century, the oceans belonged to Portugal, and the horizon no longer meant the end of the world, but its beginning. Before empire reached east, it had already drifted west. The same winds that carried Vasco da Gama around Africa also swept other ships into the open Atlantic, into waters no map described. It was not conquest they sought, but passage, routes southward that curved with the earth. Yet in that accidental turning, Portugal found another world. In 1500, a fleet under Pedro Álvares Cabral set out from Lisbon, following da Gama's course toward India. 17 ships, heavy with supplies and priests, disappeared into the mist beyond the Cape Verde Islands. Their sails vanished over the horizon, and for a month the ocean kept its secret. Then, far to the west of any known chart, the lookout on the Nicholas sighted land. Green hills rose from the sea like the edge of creation. Dense forests, birds the color of jewels, rivers wider than any in Europe. Cabral named the place Terra de Vera Cruz, the land of the true cross, and claimed it for King Manuel. The discovery was a mistake that changed history. The line drawn by the Treaty of Tordesillas, intended to divide the world between Spain and Portugal, placed this unknown coast within Portugal's share of heaven. The Spaniards would have their Indies. Portugal, by a twist of wind and parchment, had found a continent. At first, the new land seemed little more than a curiosity. Cabral's fleet lingered only a few weeks before resuming its voyage to India. He left behind no colony, only the cross of Christ planted in sand and the memory of trees that bled red sap, pau Brazil, the wood that would give the country its name. The dye made from it, brighter than any known in Europe, soon turned the forests into currency. Traders followed where explorers had passed, filling ships with timber cut by native hands in exchange for mirrors, beads, and iron knives. The coast stretched endless and wild, its harbours guarded by coral reefs and its interior veiled by jungle. The people who lived there, Tupinamba, Potiguara, Tupiniquim, had no cities or kings, only villages bound by kinship and ritual. They met the Portuguese not as subjects, but as strangers, curious and cautious. Some welcomed trade, others fought it. Along that fragile shore, the first conversations between Europe and America began, spoken in barter, mistranslation, and blood. Back in Lisbon, attention remained fixed on the east. The gold of India drowned out the whisper of Brazil's trees, yet the Atlantic refused to be silent. French corsairs began raiding the coast, cutting their own timber, claiming their own harbours. To defend what it had barely noticed, Portugal was forced to act. In 1530, King João III ordered the first official expedition of colonization, led by Martim Afonso de Sousa. His ships sailed from the Tagus into a hemisphere still largely unknown. They mapped bays and capes, charted currents, and founded a settlement at São Vicente, the first permanent colony of Brazil. The land was vast beyond imagining. Its soil, dark and rich, its climate merciless and generous in turn. Wheat withered. Sugar thrived. Cana from Madeira took root in the coastal plains, and the Atlantic winds filled with the scent of burning mills. To populate this frontier, the crown divided it into captaincies, long, narrow strips granted to noblemen and adventurers. Each donatario ruled as miniature king, responsible for settlement, defense, and salvation. Some prospered, most failed. The jungle devoured ambition as quickly as it sprouted. Disease thinned the settlers. Indian resistance burned isolated forts to ash. Yet in a few places, Pernambuco, Bahia, São Vicente, sugarcane took hold, and with it, the beginning of a new economy. The mills, called engenhos, were kingdoms unto themselves. Wooden rollers crushed cane into juice that boiled in copper vats day and night. The air filled with smoke, sweetness, and flies. Men worked until their bodies gave out, for the machinery of empire demanded more than free labor could supply. From the African coast, Luanda, Benin, São Tomé, ships began to arrive with human cargo. The Atlantic Triangle took shape. Slaves from Africa to Brazil, sugar to Lisbon, goods back to Africa. The ocean became a circuit of suffering and profit. Not all who crossed it came in chains. Jesuit missionaries arrived too, driven by zeal as fierce as any merchant's greed. They learned native tongues, built missions deep in the wilderness, and baptized whole villages. Some protected their converts from enslavement. Others justified conquest as conversion. For every chapel raised, a forest fell. The cross and the axe advanced together. By the 1540s, Brazil was no longer an accident. It was a system. Sugar plantations fed Lisbon's hunger for sweetness. Dyewood funded fleets. Slave labor turned the wilderness into arithmetic. Yet the colony remained fragile, its coasts open to attack, its settlers too few to defend what they owned. João III resolved to bring order. In 1549, he appointed a governor-general, Tomé de Sousa, to rule all Brazil from a new capital, Salvador da Bahia. Sousa's fleet carried everything a country required: soldiers, priests, builders, and bureaucrats. They anchored in a vast bay where sunlight turned the sea to glass. There, on a hill overlooking the water, they built a city of stone and faith. A cathedral crowned the heights. Streets spread downward toward the docks. Behind them rose forests that seemed to have no end. Salvador became the first true capital of the tropics, a European order grafted onto American soil. From its ramparts, the Portuguese gaze turned inward at last. They saw a land not of islands and ports, but of distances, rivers longer than empires, forests thick as thought. The Jesuits marched inland with crosses and notebooks, describing flora and souls alike. Some called the natives noble, others called them lost. None understood how profoundly both worlds were already changing. In Lisbon, the empire's rhythm still beat to the east, the Carrera de India sailing each year to Goa and back. But another pulse was forming in the west. Sugar became Portugal's second spice, its wealth rivaling pepper and clove. The same merchants who financed voyages to Ceylon now invested in mills along the Bahian coast. The Atlantic, once a path to India, was becoming an empire of its own. The ships that linked it moved in silence, carried by currents few could chart. Each one left Lisbon heavy with goods and returned heavier with profit and with ghosts. The voyage from Africa to Brazil was a descent into heat and darkness, where chained men and women survived on whispers and memory. Some captains prayed to Christ, others to the wind. All returned with their holds full and their hearts altered. In Brazil, the enslaved built everything, mills, roads, churches, and kept alive the rhythms of lands left behind. From their songs and rituals emerged a culture neither wholly African nor Portuguese, but something born between, the first echo of Brazil's future soul. The colonists clung to Europe, but the land itself was changing them, drawing their children toward a new identity that neither Lisbon nor Rome could define. By mid-century, the colony stretched from Maranhão in the north to São Vicente in the south, a narrow ribbon of settlements along a continent. Beyond the mountains lay the interior, an ocean of green, untouched and unimaginable. Rumors spoke of cities of gold hidden in the forest, of rivers that turned to silver under the moon. Explorers chased these myths and vanished. The wilderness waited, indifferent. Yet for all its fragility, Brazil had become indispensable. The wealth of the East still dazzled, but the West sustained the empire. Sugar paid for cannon, wood for shipbuilding, slaves for labor. Lisbon, perched on its river, became the counting house of two oceans. From its docks sailed fleets east to Goa and west to Salvador, their paths crossing invisibly somewhere under the equatorial sun. In that vastness, Portugal found not just power, but reflection. The same faith that had driven its kings to conquer now justified its colonies. Missionaries preached salvation in words the enslaved could not always understand. Planters built chapels beside mills where prayers rose with smoke. Across the Atlantic, the contradiction of empire stood clear. Christ and commerce, mercy and greed, bound in the same ship's log. Still, there was a strange equilibrium in it all. Portugal, a country no larger than a province of France, now ruled lands so distant that night fell in one, while dawn broke in another. Its maps stretched from the mouth of the Tagus to the far ends of the world. Yet its strength was also its weakness, a body too small for its own shadow. By 1550, the first century of empire was complete. From Goa to Bahia, from Ormuz to Luanda, the Red Cross flew over seas once thought endless. The dream that had begun in the fields of Urique that had sent caravels past Bojador and around the Cape, had found its reflection across the Atlantic. The two oceans mirrored each other, one bearing conquest, the other colony. And in that mirror lay the image of Portugal itself, a nation that had learned to live on water, to trade in faith, and to measure its greatness in the breadth of its land and in the reach of its horizon. By the middle of the 16th century, the Atlantic had become Portugal's other empire, vast, profitable, and perilous. In the east, Goa ruled an ocean. In the west, Salvador da Bahia ruled a continent. Between them stretched a network of winds and currents that bound Africa, Brazil, and Lisbon into a single organism, its lifeblood measured in sugar, gold, and human lives. The same caravels that had once carried explorers now carried cargo, sweet, heavy, and unending. The plantation world of Brazil reached its full rhythm in those years. Along the coasts of Bahia and Pernambuco, white-walled engenhos rose above green fields of cane that shimmered like water in the wind. Each estate was a small kingdom, ruled by a master whose word held the weight of law. Around the mills, a world revolved. Black slaves working the presses, native servants hauling firewood, overseers shouting orders through clouds of steam. The cane's juice boiled day and night, filling the air with a sweetness that sickened more than it tempted. The sound of the rollers never ceased. Its monotony was the heartbeat of empire. Sugar built the Portuguese Atlantic. It financed ships, soldiers, and priests, fed the court in Lisbon, and gilded the altars of churches from Porto to Bahia. A new class of merchants rose to power, men who measured salvation in profits and treated the ocean as their counting house. But the wealth had a shadow. Behind every pound of sugar stood the suffering of thousands, the invisible foundation of empire. The traffic that sustained it became routine. From Angola, Benin, and Congo, ships sailed west loaded with human cargo. Captains called it trade. Chroniclers called it mission. But in the holds of the ships, there was only darkness. Shackled men and women survived the voyage through endurance that no theology could explain. Those who lived became property in Brazil, their names erased, their histories remade. Out of their songs, languages, and pain, a new culture began to form, one that belonged neither wholly to Africa nor to Portugal, but to the space between them. Jesuit missionaries arrived to tend what conscience the planters could not afford. They preached against greed, but their flocks were bound in chains. Some worked to shield native converts from enslavement. Others turned their discipline toward organizing labor in service of the cross. They built missions that doubled as fortresses, villages of prayer and productivity, where European faith met indigenous resilience. Between the whip and the rosary, Brazil learned its contradictions. From Salvador's hilltops, the colony spread like flame along the coast. Recife grew into a commercial port, its canals echoing Venice's design. Olinda and Itamaracá prospered on sugar and slave labor, while São Vicente and Rio de Janeiro marked the southern frontier. Each new settlement pushed the line of forest back a little farther, but the jungle always waited. Beyond the mountains lay the sertão, the interior that neither priest nor planter could tame. There, native nations retreated beyond reach, their territories mapped only by rumor. In Lisbon, the empire's pulse quickened. The ships that arrived from Brazil in late summer brought silver from Angola, gold dust from Guinea, and mountains of sugar. The warehouses along the Tagus smelled of sweetness and sweat. Merchants tallied profits by candlelight, while priests blessed new expeditions. The kingdom's wealth seemed endless, but it was wealth built on wind and weather. One storm could erase a year's fortune. One fire in a mill could ruin a dynasty. Yet Portugal believed itself invincible, protected by the same providence that had carried da Gama to India and Cabral to Brazil. Africa had become the empire's workshop. São Tomé, once a place of exile, had turned into a crucible for sugar and slavery, its mills worked by those destined for Brazil. From Luanda, founded in 1575, fleets crossed the Atlantic with regular precision, carrying human lives as predictably as cargo. The triangle was complete. Europe supplied goods, Africa supplied labor, America supplied wealth. The Atlantic itself had become a machine, grinding faith, flesh, and fortune into motion. Within the colony, life settled into a fragile order. The señores de ingenio, masters of the mills, ruled with absolute power but little security. Wealth made them arrogant, the tropics made them mortal. Fevers, rebellions, and Indian attacks could undo years of profit overnight. Some sought redemption through piety, endowing churches that gleamed with gold filigree and imported marble. Others sank into decadence, their fortunes spent on luxuries imported from the very ports their slaves had built. In their world, salvation and sin shared the same altar. For the enslaved, resistance took quieter forms. Some fled into the forest, founding quilombos, hidden communities where African languages, dances, and religions survived beyond the reach of colonial law. Others resisted through endurance, turning work songs into memory and memory into identity. The masters believed they ruled bodies. The slaves proved they ruled the soul. As Brazil's coast prospered, its frontiers pulled the empire inland. Adventurers known as bandeirantes began exploring the wilderness in search of gold, captives, and fame. They followed rivers deep into the continent, leaving trails of destruction and discovery alike. Their expeditions blurred the line between explorer and predator, yet they expanded Portugal's reach far beyond the limits imagined in Lisbon. The Sabá Sertão, once thought impenetrable, became the next horizon. The Jesuits followed these paths too, seeking not gold, but souls. Their missions stretched into Paraguay and the Amazon, building communities where native languages were written down for the first time, and where European and indigenous customs mingled in uneasy harmony. Some of these missions grew into self-sufficient towns. Others were destroyed by slavers or abandoned to the jungle. Yet their memory endured, part of the moral map of a continent still being drawn. In Europe, the balance of power was shifting. Spain, united under a single crown, had become the giant of Christendom. Its galleons carried Mexican silver and Peruvian gold, wealth that dwarfed even Portugal's eastern riches. The two Iberian empires eyed each other across the ocean's invisible line, their rivalry both fraternal and fatal. Yet Portugal's mastery of the sea remained unchallenged. No other nation could match its navigators. No other maps were so precise. No other fleets so relentless. The world, it seemed, had been divided, and Portugal held its half securely. But empires are never still. By the 1570s, shadows gathered over Lisbon. The population of Portugal itself was small, too small for the demands of a global empire. Each year, thousands of men left for Africa, India, and Brazil. Few returned. The homeland emptied as the world filled with its sons. The crown struggled to govern territories it could barely staff. Governors fought among themselves, priests feuded with planters, and local councils ruled as they pleased. The very distances that had made Portugal powerful now threatened to pull it apart. Brazil, meanwhile, was beginning to think of itself less as a colony and more as a world of its own. Children born on its soil called themselves Brasileiros, not Portuguese. They spoke a language braided with African rhythm and indigenous words, prayed to saints under tropical skies, and measured time by the rhythm of the harvest. The Atlantic, once a link, was slowly becoming a separation. Still, Lisbon refused to see it. The city glittered like a reliquary, its churches overflowing with gold from across the seas. King Sebastian, young and reckless, dreamed of new crusades in Morocco, imagining glory where caution was needed. The empire's energy, once creative, turned desperate. In 1578, the king led an army across the desert and vanished with it at Alcácer Quibir, swallowed by sand and legend. His death without heir plunged Portugal into crisis. 2 years later, in 1580, Spain's Philip II claimed the Portuguese crown, uniting the Iberian realms under one rule. For 60 years, Portugal would remain bound to Spain, a union that preserved its empire but dimmed its independence. The caravels still sailed, the sugar still flowed, but the heart that had dreamed the seas now beat under another's shadow. Yet even in subjugation, Portugal's achievement could not be undone. From the cliffs of Sagres to the forests of Brazil, its spirit had circled the globe. The nation that had once fought for survival on the edge of Europe had become the first to master the edge of the world. As the 16th century closed, the Atlantic shimmered with its reflection, an ocean that belonged to no single land, but to all the destinies Portugal had set in motion. Across that water moved ships, prayers and songs, some born of freedom, others of chains, all echoing the same truth. The dream that began as faith had become geography. The seas that once separated worlds now joined them, and Portugal, small, daring, and tired, had drawn the first map of the modern age. The death of King Sebastian in the desert of Morocco left Portugal suspended between myth and mourning. For generations, his disappearance would be told as prophecy, the young monarch sleeping beneath the waves, waiting to return when his people needed him. But in 1578, the loss was no legend. The kingdom stood leaderless, its armies destroyed, its pride buried in foreign sand. Across the Tagus, bells tolled through a city that had grown rich on distant oceans and now faced the emptiness of its own shore. 2 years later, the crown passed to a foreign hand. Philip II of Spain, ruler of the world's mightiest empire, claimed Portugal's throne through his mother's blood. The nobles hesitated, the merchants calculated, the priests blessed what could not be stopped. Spanish soldiers marched into Lisbon with banners raised, and the two crowns of Iberia were joined. The union promised continuity, even strength, yet beneath its formal vows lay unease. Portugal had once dreamed the world. It now belonged to someone else's dream. At first, little seemed to change. Philip swore to respect Portuguese law, language, and empire. The fleets continued to sail from the Tagus, one toward Goa, another toward Brazil, another around the Cape. Gold and sugar flowed through Lisbon's warehouses, though the profit no longer felt entirely its own. The Spanish court, seated far away in Madrid, viewed the Portuguese dominions as another extension of its reach, a convenient source of ships and silver to feed its wars. For the merchants of Lisbon, the union was a transaction. For the sailors, a sentence. The change revealed itself slowly, like a tide rising unnoticed. Spanish ambitions drew Portugal into conflicts that were not its own. The Dutch, newly freed from Spanish rule, struck first, privateers from Zeeland and Amsterdam, who knew the sea as well as any Iberian pilot. They sailed into the Atlantic with hunger, sharpened by rebellion, capturing Portuguese ships. raiding sugar ports in Brazil, seizing fortresses along the African coast. Each attack echoed across the ocean like the shattering of glass. In Bahia, the planters watched their profits burn in ships set alight at anchor. In Angola, slavers fortified their outposts, unsure which flag to trust. In India, Dutch fleets began to shadow Portuguese carracks along the trade routes to Malacca. The Portuguese governors wrote letters home begging for aid, but Madrid's answers were delayed by wars in Flanders and the cost of empire too vast to measure. Lisbon's merchants realized that for all its promises, Spain's protection had brought them into the crosshairs of every enemy Spain had ever made. Within the kingdom itself, the mood changed from loyalty to endurance. Taxes rose to fund Spanish armies fighting in Europe. Grain prices climbed while the value of pepper fell. The gold that once gilded Lisbon's churches now paid for soldiers who never saw the sea. The capital's palaces still shone, but their courtyards whispered of decay. Portugal had become both partner and prisoner, an empire still afloat but steered by another hand. Across the Atlantic, Brazil continued to grow, feeding the crown's coffers even as the homeland strained. The engenhos of Pernambuco and Bahia multiplied, their mills echoing like drums through the valleys. Sugar exports reached record heights, yet the wealth lingered in colonial hands or vanished into Madrid's treasury. A new elite emerged, the Brasileiros, men born on American soil, who spoke with Portuguese accents and tropical confidence. They traded directly with Europe, commanded their own fleets, and began to sense a destiny separate from the old kingdom's fatigue. The church remained the empire's most constant presence. Jesuits expanded their missions deeper into the interior, building schools, printing presses, and sanctuaries that shimmered like beacons in the wilderness. Their letters described lands filled with promise and peril, where faith could flourish without the corruption of Europe's courts. But even they felt the strain of the Union. Spanish officials sought to centralize authority, and the autonomy that had allowed Portugal's priests to experiment and adapt began to narrow. The missions survived by persistence rather than favor. In Asia, the story turned darker. The Estado de India, once the proud engine of global trade, was beginning to crack. The Dutch and English East India companies rose with calculated ambition, their fleets disciplined, their purpose commercial rather than crusading. In Malacca, Ceylon, and the Moluccas, Portuguese garrisons found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. Goa remained magnificent, its cathedrals blazing with gold, its streets filled with processions, but its power grew ceremonial. The spice trade slipped through new hands. Lisbon watched helplessly as rivals adopted the very techniques Portugal had pioneered. The caravel, the map, the trade route, the alliance bought with gifts and firepower. The knowledge that had once set the kingdom apart had become common property of the age it created. Even its maps were no longer secrets. Dutch cartographers published them in elegant atlases, turning Portuguese discovery into northern profit. Yet in the midst of decline, the habit of endurance held. Portuguese captains continued to command the sea's edges, with a professionalism unmatched by their rivals. They fought with discipline rather than illusion, their courage sharpened by generations of necessity. In Africa, forts like Elmina, Luanda, and Mozambique remained loyal, guarded by mixed communities of settlers, soldiers, and Africans bound together by trade and faith. The empire survived not through wealth or strategy, but through the stubborn identity of those who refused to let it vanish. In the homeland, memory became Portugal's refuge. Chroniclers wrote histories that turned the past into consolation. They described the age of discovery with reverence, the navigators and their caravels as saints of a lost gospel. The older generation looked backward for meaning, while the younger looked outward for survival. Sailors from Madeira and the Azores continued to cruise Spanish fleets crossing the Atlantic, their songs still in Portuguese, their loyalty still to the sea. Among them spread the quiet hope that the union was temporary, that one day the crown would return to native hands. The myth of Sebastian, the lost king, transformed from mourning into expectation. Preachers claimed to see omens of his return, a messianic vision that stirred both faith and resistance. Sebastian's ghost became a kind of political weather, drifting through taverns and monasteries, a reminder that Portugal's soul remained its own, even if its crown did not. Meanwhile, Brazil's world kept expanding. Sugar exports doubled. New towns rose along the coast. Slave ships increased their voyages from Africa. The colony's capital, Salvador, glittered with churches built from lime and coral stone, their interiors lined with gold leaf hammered by African hands. Processions filled the streets with incense and music. For Lisbon, Brazil was the empire's beating heart, the colony that paid for Europe's wars. Yet distance bred difference. Planters grew wealthy, their sons educated in Coimbra, but returning with the arrogance of landowners who had never seen the homeland. The Atlantic no longer separated mother and child. It divided them. By the turn of the century, storms of politics and prophecy mingled in Portugal's air. Famine struck the countryside, and trade slowed as Dutch blockades choked Atlantic routes. Pirates haunted the Azores, seizing the treasure fleets from Brazil. Lisbon's splendor dulled. Its warehouses stood half empty. The Spanish court demanded more soldiers and sailors for its wars, stripping Portugal of the men who might have rebuilt it. Each absence deepened the silence of a country that had once filled the world with its voice. Still, the empire endured by habit. Governors in Goa and Bahia ruled in the king's name, but answered to their own reality. They negotiated with local powers, managed alliances, and kept the system running through compromise. The ocean, vast and restless, continued to connect everything. Across it traveled sugar and silver, faith and rumor, memory and hope. Portugal lived within that motion, surviving by the momentum it had created centuries before. By 1610, the Iberian Union seemed permanent. The two crowns shared armies, churches, and bureaucracy, yet their hearts beat to different rhythms. Spain fought for domination in Europe. Portugal still listened to the sea. Though ruled by another's monarch, its sailors charted new waters. Its merchants bartered in ports from Brazil to Bengal, and its priests wrote letters that turned geography into scripture. The body of the kingdom was bound to Madrid, but its spirit remained ungovernable. In that contradiction lay the quiet endurance of a nation that refused to vanish. The world it had discovered was now discovering itself through others. Yet Portugal's name still clung to the winds and maps of every ocean. Beneath the shadow of empire, the old dream persisted, a dream of distance mastered, of faith carried beyond sight, of a small land whose greatness had never depended on size. The age of conquest had passed into memory, yet memory itself had become Portugal's last empire, vast as the sea and no less enduring. By the 17th century, the union with Spain had aged into habit. Kings changed in Madrid, but Portugal's reality remained. Its name carried weight, its flag did not. The fleets still left Lisbon each spring, their holds filled with sugar from Bahia and silver from Angola, yet their profits vanished into Spanish wars. The country that had once shaped the world was now one province of another man's ambition. beneath the surface, discontent spread like slow fire. The old nobility resented Spanish governors who spoke little Portuguese and understood less. The merchants cursed the embargoes that barred them from trading with Protestant nations. The Dutch, shut out of Iberian ports, struck directly at the source of wealth. In 1605, they seized Ambon and Tidore in the Spice Islands. A decade later, they blockaded Goa and raided the coasts of Africa. In the Atlantic, they captured Elmina, São Tomé, and parts of Angola. To strike Spain, they plundered Portugal. The damage was more than economic. It wounded pride. Lisbon's mariners, heirs of da Gama and Albuquerque, watched their legacy unravel at the hands of rivals using their own tools. Better ships, better organization. The same courage, but with purpose unburdened by empire's decay. The Dutch called it trade. The Portuguese recognized conquest. For the first time in 2 centuries, they were being pushed from the seas they had named. In Brazil, the crisis reached the sugar mills. Dutch privateers prowled the Atlantic, capturing convoys, disrupting exports, and seizing ports. In 1624, they took Salvador da Bahia, raising their flag above the cathedral where Portugal's empire had first been consecrated. Panic swept through the colonies. The Senhores de Engenho fled inland, taking their slaves and their saints with them. For a year, the city lay under foreign control, its churches looted, its archives burned. Help came not from Madrid's distant armies, but from the resilience that had always defined Portugal's people. Colonial militias gathered with African freedmen, native allies, and Jesuit priests. They fought from the jungle, striking at night and vanishing by dawn. In 1625, a combined fleet from Portugal and Spain finally arrived, driving the Dutch out after months of siege. Salvador returned to Portuguese hands, though its scars remained. The victory was costly. Each reprieve depended on cooperation with Spain, yet Spanish wars elsewhere drained resources faster than they could be restored. The Dutch returned again in 1630, this time to Pernambuco, where the sugar fields were richest. They came not as raiders, but as settlers, founding a new colony under the banner of the Dutch West India Company. Its governor, Johann Moritz of Nassau, ruled with precision and curiosity, bringing engineers, painters, and scholars to map and record the tropics. Dutch Brazil became a mirror to the Portuguese colony, modern, disciplined, and prosperous. The Portuguese planters, trapped between loyalty and necessity, often made uneasy peace with the occupiers. Trade continued, and sugar still flowed across the Atlantic, but the old order trembled. The Dutch built forts along the coast, expelled Jesuits, and forged alliances with local tribes. The empire that had once dominated the seas now fought for survival in its own harbors. In Africa, similar tides turned. The loss of Luanda to Dutch forces in 1641 nearly severed the link between the slave coast and Brazil. The transatlantic circuit, the machine that had powered the Portuguese Atlantic, stalled. Captains rerouted through precarious channels, dealing secretly with African rulers who demanded guns and cloth in exchange for captives. The church condemned the traffic. The economy demanded it. Between sin and survival, empire found compromise. Within Portugal, the sense of dispossession deepened. Madrid's taxes rose while privileges shrank. Spanish officials treated Lisbon as an appendage, useful only for its ports. The court's intrigues favored Castilian nobles. Portuguese voices went unheard. Every defeat overseas echoed in the homeland, turning frustration into quiet rebellion. The myths of independence, long dormant, began to stir again. In taverns and monasteries, men whispered of the old days, of Afonso Henriques and the Battle of Urique, of Prince Henry and the caravels. Sebastian's legend returned in new form, the promise that one day Portugal would awaken from foreign rule as it had once awakened from obscurity. Even the clergy began to echo such prophecies in sermons disguised as homilies. The empire's decline had become the soil of nationalism. While the homeland brooded, the colonies adapted. Brazil's settlers learned to govern themselves out of necessity. Planters built militias, negotiated with native groups, and even arranged truces with Dutch commanders when distant kings could not. The society that emerged was hybrid and pragmatic, a reflection of its own geography. In Bahia, Catholic processions wound through streets lined with African drummers. In Pernambuco, sugar barons built palaces from stone quarried by enslaved hands. The colony had begun to think of itself as a world complete, yet the dream of independence never died. In 1640, opportunity arrived like a sudden wind. Spain was exhausted from decades of war, rebellions in Catalonia, enemies in Flanders, and rivals across the seas. Its treasury was drained, its armies stretched thin. In Lisbon, a circle of conspirators decided the moment had come. Among them stood nobles, clergy, and merchants, united by loss and memory. They moved on the 1st of December, seizing the royal palace, imprisoning the Spanish governor, and proclaiming João, Duke of Braganza, as king. The revolution was swift and bloodless. When the bells of Lisbon rang that morning, they announced not revolt but resurrection. Crowds filled the streets, shouting the name of João IV, the restorer. For the first time in 60 years, Portugal had a native king. Spain's soldiers, scattered across its distant wars, could not return in time to crush the uprising. A new banner rose above the towers of the Jerónimos monastery, and with it, the ancient pride of a nation reborn. The Restoration War that followed lasted 28 years, a slow conflict fought as much with diplomacy as with muskets. Portugal's survival depended on alliances, with France against Spain, with England through marriage and trade. The new monarchy balanced caution and courage, sending envoys to every court that might recognize its independence. Across Europe, weary of Spanish dominance, the great powers welcomed another counterweight. In the colonies, loyalty shifted as swiftly as the wind. Brazil, whose wealth sustained the realm, pledged allegiance to João IV. Governors there raised the old flag over forts and churches, declaring that the Atlantic Empire belonged once again to its rightful crown. The news spread across oceans through sermons, songs, and sails. Even in the Far East, at Goa and Macau, the announcement was received with muted hope. Portuguese captains toasted their restored king in taverns along every coast they still controlled. The fight to reclaim the lost empire unfolded on many fronts. In Africa, forces loyal to Braganza retook Luanda in 1648, aided by soldiers and settlers from Brazil. The operation, commanded by Salvador Correa de Sá, symbolized the new interdependence of the Atlantic world, a colony rescuing its mother kingdom's dominion. The same year, Dutch garrisons in Brazil began to collapse under guerrilla warfare, led by Luso-Brazilian militias and their African and indigenous allies. The recapture of Recife in 1654 would complete what began in those years, a reversal of fortune that restored the Atlantic balance to Portuguese hands. But in 1640, all of that was still future. The moment was fragile, the outcome uncertain. João IV faced an empire frayed by distance, a treasury emptied by foreign kings, and a people weary of faith's cost. Yet something deeper had been restored, the belief that Portugal's fate remained its own, the same stubborn confidence that had carried caravels around the Cape. now sustained a nation through exhaustion. The rebellion's success owed less to armies than to memory. The empire's farthest outposts, built by men who had lived and died for centuries in isolation, still thought of themselves as Portuguese. Their loyalty was not to Madrid's bureaucracy, but to the stories of discovery, to the idea of a small land capable of vast deeds. That imagination proved stronger than occupation. When the first fleet bearing the Braganza coat of arms sailed from Lisbon, its destination was neither Goa nor the Azores, but the future itself. The ships carried not gold or sugar, but the emblem of continuity, the faith that Portugal's name would endure. By the close of 1640, cannon fire echoed from the fortresses of the Tagus, but this time it celebrated liberation. The bells that once tolled for Sebastian's ghost now rang for something real. The kingdom had reclaimed its breath after a generation of silence. The Portuguese Empire stood battered, diminished, and scattered across oceans, but it still existed. From Bahia to Luanda, from Goa to Macau, its echoes answered the call of home. In the long twilight of empire, Portugal had rediscovered the virtue that had once made it immortal, the will to begin again. Freedom had returned to Portugal, but it came wrapped in exhaustion. The bells of Lisbon rang for King João IV, the restorer, yet the air they filled was weary from decades of silence. The city's towers were weathered, its treasury empty, its navy scattered across oceans that no longer recognized its flag. The empire Portugal had reclaimed was not the radiant order of Manuel's time. It was a mosaic of battered fortresses and forgotten colonies, held together by habit and hope. The task ahead was not to discover the world again, but to remember how to hold it. João knew that victory meant survival, not expansion. His first acts were not proclamations of glory, but letters to governors across the seas, reminding them that Portugal lived. In Goa, in Luanda, in Salvador da Bahia, the news of restoration reached through rumor and prayer before official messengers arrived. Flags were mended, oaths renewed, masses sung in thanksgiving. For men who had spent a lifetime under foreign rule, the words King of Portugal and the Algarves once again carried weight. The Restoration War dragged on across Europe, draining what little Portugal possessed. Fields lay untended, ships rotted in their slips, but the spirit that had survived 2 generations of occupation would not bend again. The Braganza kings ruled as caretakers of endurance. They taxed salt and tobacco, borrowed from merchants, and promised payment in victories yet to come. Even as Spain sought to crush its reborn neighbor, Portuguese troops defended their borders with the tenacity of a people who had already lost everything once. Across the Atlantic, Brazil's plantations continued their rhythm, indifferent to the crowns that rose and fell in Europe. Sugar was still gold, and its profits, even reduced by war, kept the realm afloat. Governors in Bahia and Pernambuco raised militias to repel Dutch attacks. Their loyalty to the Braganza line affirmed through the familiar ritual of survival. When Salvador Correa de Sá recaptured Luanda in 1648, the chain of the Atlantic, Brazil to Africa, Africa to Lisbon, was restored. The empire's arteries beat again, however faintly. The peace with Spain came in 1668, when exhaustion defeated ambition on both sides. The Treaty of Lisbon confirmed what the people had already declared. Portugal was independent. The victory was quiet, lacking parades or trumpet calls, but its meaning reached deeper than conquest. For the first time in centuries, Portugal's fate belonged only to itself. Freedom, however, revealed fragility. The old centers of wealth, Goa, Malacca, Ormuz, had faded into memory. The Indian Ocean, once a Portuguese lake, belonged now to the Dutch and the English. Lisbon's galleons, built for glory, could not compete with the sleek merchant ships of Amsterdam or London. The empire's center of gravity shifted toward the Atlantic, toward the plantations that grew richer even as the homeland grew poorer. In Brazil, the balance of power changed. The planters, emboldened by distance and profit, began to act as masters not only of their estates, but of their provinces. The Jesuits, guardians of both conscience and control, fought to restrain their cruelty and protect the remaining native populations. The struggle became open warfare in some regions, with missions burned and priests expelled. The colony was no longer an outpost. It was a civilization, and its contradictions mirrored those of Portugal itself. Faith and greed, mercy and domination, bound into one destiny. In Africa, Luanda and Benguela supplied Brazil's mills with captives drawn from the interior. The slave trade reached its cruel maturity during these years, systematized by royal charter and financed by Lisbon's merchants. The Atlantic had become an empire of motion, its ships sailing in endless triangles, carrying goods, people, and power between continents that could no longer exist apart. Each voyage strengthened the economy while hollowing the conscience of the realm. João's successors faced a different world. Afonso VI, born sickly and ill-prepared, reigned in name while ministers ruled in his stead. Under them, Portugal's diplomacy matured into pragmatism. Alliances with England brought naval protection in exchange for trade privileges. Alliances with Rome secured spiritual legitimacy for colonial wealth. The marriage of Catherine of Braganza to Charles II of England in 1662 sealed this partnership. Her dowry included Bombay and Tangier, symbols of empire traded like currency, but it also bound Portugal to a power rising as surely as Spain had once risen. The 17th century's middle decades were not an age of expansion, but of consolidation. Lisbon learned to govern through distance. The Conselho Ultramarino, the Overseas Council, managed far-flung territories with the precision of a clockmaker, issuing decrees that took months to arrive and longer to be obeyed. Bureaucracy replaced adventure. The language of empire shifted from the poetry of discovery to the prose of administration. Yet beneath the paper and ink, the same restlessness stirred. Goa remained the crown's eastern citadel, still proud, still glittering, though its harbour now saw more Dutch and English sails than Portuguese. Its viceroys ruled like monarchs over a diminished realm, presiding over courts where Indian princes, European merchants, and Jesuit scholars debated in a dozen tongues. Christianity, long since rooted there, had grown its own branches. The churches of Goa shone with gold leaf, while outside their walls, the spice markets thrived as they always had, indifferent to any flag. In Macau, at the edge of China, Portuguese merchants maintained a fragile enclave of trade and translation. Jesuit scientists taught astronomy to Ming officials, and scholars sent letters home describing a civilization older and more intricate than Europe's. Portugal's empire had become less a chain of conquest than a web of contact. It survived not through force, but through fluency, its ability to listen, adapt, and trade. At home, the Braganza court sought to rebuild a kingdom worthy of its history. The reconstruction of Lisbon's waterfront brought order to the chaos of its docks. The gold from Brazil's sugar and Angola's slaves financed new palaces, though each gleam of marble carried the echo of distant suffering. Portuguese art and music flourished again, steeped in the melancholy that came to define the nation's soul. Saudade, the longing for what had been and might yet be. By the 1680s, the Atlantic had become Portugal's true dominion. The Indian Ocean was lost, but the western seas were thriving. New generations of Brasileiros, Portuguese by name, American by birth, expanded agriculture, founded towns, and looked inland toward the promise of gold, rumored in the mountains of Minas Gerais. Expeditions, called bandeiras, set out from São Paulo, driven by hunger and ambition. They crossed forests, rivers, and savannas, capturing native peoples and searching for veins of metal that glinted in the sunlight. Most returned empty-handed. A few returned rich enough to alter history. The discovery of gold in Brazil's interior at the century's close transformed both colony and crown. The streams of Minas Gerais ran with dust that turned to coins in Lisbon's mint. A new tide of wealth poured across the Atlantic, reviving the old illusion that providence still favored Portugal. Yet prosperity brought dependence. The monarchy became addicted to gold as once it had been to spice. The city glittered again, but the kingdom beneath it remained brittle. In those years, Portugal's identity settled into something durable and paradoxical. A small nation that thought in continents, a kingdom bound by the sea more tightly than by land. The empire no longer expanded by conquest. It endured through connection. Its ports were outposts of exchange where African, European, and Asian lives intertwined. Its faith traveled farther than its armies. Its people, scattered from Goa to Bahia, carried the same language as a thread through the vast fabric of the early modern world. Yet behind the triumphs lingered fatigue. The empire that had once been the cutting edge of history was becoming a relic of its own invention. England and Holland controlled the oceans through fleets Portugal could no longer match. Spanish silver and French industry dominated Europe's markets. Lisbon's wealth, gleaming in its churches, masked dependence on foreign allies. But decline came quietly, disguised as stability. The Braganza kings ruled with measured dignity, content to preserve what remained rather than gamble for what was lost. When the 17th century ended, Portugal stood at a strange equilibrium. The wars were over, the frontiers fixed, the routes across the Atlantic secure. The empire stretched from Africa to Brazil, from Asia's fringes to the Azores, a constellation of ports linked by faith, trade, and memory. It no longer dictated the edge, but still shaped its rhythm. The world it had once discovered now revolved to patterns it had set in motion long ago. In the echo of those tides, the Portuguese spirit endured, patient, devout, resilient, and quietly proud. A century after restoration, the dream that had begun in a boy king's rebellion at Urique still carried the weight of continuity. The age of discovery had faded into history, but discovery itself had changed form. It lived now in survival, in the ability of a small nation to remain visible in a world it had made vast. The dawn of the 18th century found Portugal both rich and restless. Gold from Brazil poured into Lisbon in torrents, carried by fleets that glittered on the Atlantic like moving fortresses. The kingdom had not known such prosperity since the days of Manuel the Fortunate. Coins struck from Brazilian metal bore the cross of Christ and the face of the Braganza kings. Chalices, crowns, and altarpieces gleamed with the same distant light. Lisbon became the envy of Europe, a capital rebuilt in marble and music. Yet beneath the splendor, the old fragility persisted. The gold that dazzled the court dulled the will to create. Mines in Minas Gerais supplied the crown with inexhaustible wealth, but they drained the colony's labor and Lisbon's conscience. Caravans of enslaved Africans and indigenous captives trudged into the interior, working rivers and hills until the landscape itself seemed to bleed metal. Each ounce of gold carried the silence of those who had dug it. The discovery reshaped Brazil. Villages that had once clung to the coast now swelled into cities deep in the mountains. Ouro Preto, Mariana, Sabará. Roads carved through the wilderness linked the mines to the ports of Rio de Janeiro and Bahia. Taverns, chapels, and markets multiplied overnight, creating a civilization born from dust and desire. Alongside the miners came priests, tax collectors, and smugglers. Every fortune attracted its shadow. The crown demanded its share through the quinto, a royal fifth on all extracted gold. To enforce it, soldiers patrolled the routes, searching for contraband and rebels. The riches changed the balance of empire. Rio de Janeiro, once a provincial harbor, replaced Salvador as the colony's capital. Its bay, sheltered and deep, became the center of an Atlantic system where everything converged. Gold from the mines, sugar from the plantations, slaves from Angola, merchants from every coast of Europe. From there, fleets sailed for Lisbon twice a year, escorted by warships against pirates who haunted the mid-ocean routes. The journey became the artery of empire, its rhythms so steady that time itself seemed to move with it. In Lisbon, the influx of gold transformed life and imagination. Churches rose in Baroque splendor, their interiors a riot of gilded wood carved into visions of paradise. Music filled their naves, candles reflected on altars covered in the very metal, mined by hands that would never see them. The streets gleamed with new palaces, and the royal court lived as though wealth were eternal. But fortune is a tide, and it carries arrogance before ruin. When João V took the throne in 1706, he saw himself as God's chosen monarch, a second Solomon ruling a kingdom blessed with inexhaustible treasure. He spent freely on art, on cathedrals, on alliances with Rome that flattered his piety and emptied his treasury. His reign produced beauty on a scale Portugal had never seen. The vast Mafra Palace, the luminous tiles that covered Lisbon's facades, the libraries that housed the wisdom of a global empire. Yet for every masterpiece raised in stone, ships rotted in harbors, soldiers went unpaid, and industry languished. Beyond the palaces, the world was changing. England, once Portugal's junior ally, now ruled the seas. Its merchants dominated Atlantic trade. Its navy protected Portuguese convoys in exchange for control of commerce. The Treaty of Methuen, signed in 1703, bound the two nations together through mutual dependency. English wool for Portuguese wine, English protection for Portuguese obedience. The alliance preserved the empire, but mortgaged its autonomy. Lisbon's prosperity came increasingly through British markets and British ships. In Brazil, prosperity bred tension. The goldfields drew thousands. Adventurers from Portugal, free men of colour, escaped slaves, and opportunists of every kind. Camps turned to towns, towns to cities, and with growth came rivalry. The colonial authorities struggled to control populations that felt more Brazilian than Portuguese. When the crown tightened taxation, miners rebelled, leading to uprisings that foreshadowed greater unrest. The most famous, the Inconfidencia Mineira of 1789, dreamed of independence in words learned from the Enlightenment and the revolutions across the Atlantic. Its leaders, poets, officers, intellectuals planned to found a republic in the mountains. The conspiracy was crushed, and its poet hero, Tiradentes, hanged as a traitor. Yet his execution marked the birth of another idea, that Brazil was no longer a colony, but a country waiting for its name. The empire's contradictions multiplied. While Lisbon basked in the glow of Brazilian gold, the rest of the overseas world faded. In Africa, Portugal's presence narrowed to a handful of fortified ports: Luanda, Benguela, Mozambique. In Asia, Goa remained nominally powerful but isolated, its glory reduced to memory and marble. Macau survived by diplomacy and trade, a fragile outpost sustained by China's tolerance. The old dream of a universal empire had condensed into two pillars, Brazil and the slave trade that fed it. Then, in 1755, the illusion of permanence shattered. On All Saints' Day, as the faithful filled Lisbon's churches, the earth convulsed. The city collapsed in minutes, roofs crashing into sanctuaries, fires consuming streets, tidal waves drowning those who fled to the river. Tens of thousands perished. The capital of empire became a ruin of smoke and ash. For survivors, it felt like divine judgment on centuries of pride. From the rubble rose the figure who would remake the kingdom, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later the Marquis of Pombal. Cold, brilliant, and ruthless, he rebuilt Lisbon with stone and reason. Streets were laid in grids, buildings rose with equal facades. Superstition gave way to order. His reconstruction turned catastrophe into rebirth. But Pombal's reforms reached beyond architecture. He sought to rebuild the state itself, centralizing power, modernizing administration, and curbing the influence of the church. Under his direction, Jesuit missions in Brazil were suppressed, their lands seized for the crown. The Society of Jesus, once empire's conscience, was accused of rebellion and expelled in 1759. Pombal's rule replaced spiritual authority with secular control, pushing Portugal toward the Enlightenment while leaving it haunted by the loss of faith's old cohesion. He encouraged science, industry, and education, believing reason could succeed where devotion had failed. Yet his vision carried the same flaw as every reformer's. He mistook power for permanence. By the late 18th century, Portugal had regained its capital, but lost its confidence. The gold shipments dwindled as the mines declined. European wars disrupted trade, and English merchants dictated prices in Lisbon's markets. Brazil remained loyal but restless, its elites enriched and impatient with distant rule. The empire was still vast, but its heart had slowed. Pombal's successors lacked his energy. After his dismissal in 1777, the court slid back into ceremony, content to live on inherited grandeur. The Queen, Maria I, ruled with genuine piety but fragile mind, while her ministers watched Europe unravel in revolution and war. The Napoleonic storms gathering across the continent would soon reach Portugal's shore. In Brazil, meanwhile, the colony matured into a civilization of its own. Baroque cities bloomed in the interior, their churches carved by artisans who mixed European design with native imagination. Scholars founded academies, and poets wrote verses that blended classical form with tropical color. The colony's wealth financed art, learning, and a sense of self that no longer looked only toward Lisbon. Across the Atlantic, a new world had learned to exist without waiting for permission. The century closed, with Portugal caught between its glorious past and uncertain future. The gold had made it splendid and dependent, enlightened and complacent. Its empire was no longer a story of expansion, but of endurance, an archipelago of memories connected by trade winds and faith. The same ocean that had carried caravels now carried news of revolution from France, rebellion from America, and ideas that no empire could contain. In 1807, the armies of Napoleon crossed the border, and the old order at last gave way. The royal family, urged by its British allies, fled across the Atlantic to Brazil. As Lisbon's harbour filled with enemy sails, the court embarked for Rio de Janeiro, the first capital of Europe to abandon the continent for its colony. The ships disappeared into the same ocean that had once carried discovery, conquest, and gold. The departure was more than escape. It was transformation. The kingdom that had taught the world to sail was now carried by the very winds it once commanded. On that voyage, the empire turned inside out. The colony became the center, the homeland its shadow. The journey closed 3 centuries of ambition and began the age of reckoning. Portugal, small and enduring, had survived kings, earthquakes, and decline. It had crossed every horizon the world could offer and found itself reflected there. The age of discovery was long past, yet the desire to begin again still followed every ship that left the Tagus, vanishing toward another dawn. Winds rose over the Tagus in November 1807 as the royal fleet slipped away under leaden skies. Within its holds sailed the crown, the court, and what remained of Portugal's faith in its own endurance. Cannons echoed faintly from the coast, the sound of an age ending. Behind the ships, Lisbon disappeared into rain. Ahead waited the ocean that had once carried discovery and conquest, now bearing exile. For weeks the fleet fought storms and hunger, drifting through gales that scattered its formation. When at last the convoy reached the Bay of Guanabara, the tropics opened before it like a reprieve. Rio de Janeiro, a city of merchants and sugar warehouses, became the new capital of a European empire displaced across the Atlantic. Palaces were improvised from manor houses. Officials disembarked with ceremony that tried to disguise desperation. The court had fled as refugees, but arrived as rulers. João, hesitant by nature yet surprisingly capable, governed from his borrowed throne with the caution of a man who had survived humiliation. He decreed Brazil's ports open to all friendly nations, shattering centuries of economic confinement. British merchants flooded into Rio, their flags fluttering over new customs houses, their influence expanding with each loan extended to the crown. Within months, the colony's isolation ended, and its cities hummed with foreign trade and sudden ambition. The Atlantic, once a boundary, had become the bridge between 2 halves of a single realm. Lisbon, meanwhile, endured the occupation it could not resist. French troops converted churches into barracks and palaces into quarters for generals. Farms starved, streets emptied, and what had been the proudest port of Europe turned silent under foreign rule. When liberation came in 1811, it brought little relief. Portugal had become a country without a monarch and an empire governed from afar. In Rio, the shift felt like sunrise after centuries of twilight. Commerce flourished, theatres opened, universities taught law and medicine to a new generation who saw themselves not as colonials, but as citizens of a kingdom reborn in the tropics. Newspapers printed in Portuguese and French debated liberty, monarchy, and nationhood. Every dock, every market stall, every foreign ship reminded Brazil that it no longer needed permission to exist. The court had meant to preserve empire. Instead, it had awakened independence. By 1820, the tide turned again. Revolutions in Spain and the reverberations of Napoleon's fall ignited unrest across Europe. Portugal's merchants, long excluded from the prosperity of Rio, demanded the king's return. Troops mutinied in Porto. Constitutionalists marched under banners of reform. João hesitated, torn between the world he had left and the one he had built. In 1821, he sailed back across the ocean, leaving his son, Dom Pedro, as regent in Brazil. The voyage reversed history, a homeland reclaiming its monarch from the colony that had outgrown it. Dom Pedro, young and impulsive, watched the growing defiance around him. Brazilian elites, enriched by trade and proud of autonomy, rejected any return to subordination. When Lisbon's new Cortes ordered his recall, he refused. On a September morning in 1822, He drew his sword beside the Ipiranga River and declared Brazil independent. His cry, independence or death, was both rebellion and inheritance, echoing the courage that had once defined his ancestors across the sea. Portugal awoke to find its empire reduced to fragments. The jewel of its dominion was gone, and with it, the wealth that had sustained its illusions. What remained was a scattered constellation of territories: Angola, Mozambique, Goa, Macau, and Timor, each distant, each indispensable. The nation turned inward, searching for meaning in memory. Lisbon rebuilt itself as best it could, its facades bright, its treasury empty. Poets wrote of loss with the calm of resignation, inventing a word for it that would outlast empires: saudade. Decades passed in quiet recovery. The 19th century unfolded like a long echo of former greatness. Steamships replaced caravels, and the telegraph-bound oceans that no longer needed explorers. Portugal governed its African and Asian possessions through decrees sent by cable and wars fought by proxy. Industrial powers, Britain, France, later Germany, carved up continents in their own image. Amid these giants, Lisbon claimed a moral heritage as Europe's oldest empire, guardian of a civilizing mission rooted in faith and language. It was pride built on dust, but it endured. Under King Pedro V, and later his successors, the monarchy tried to reform without losing its sanctity. Railways crossed the countryside, schools opened, politics turned restless. The republican movements of the late century found inspiration in France and resentment at home. In 1910, a revolution toppled the crown, ending nearly 8 centuries of monarchy. The republic that followed promised renewal, but delivered turmoil. Governments rising and falling faster than tides. Generals ruling where elections faltered. Amid instability, Africa remained the last refuge of empire. Angola's highlands and Mozambique's coastlines became symbols of permanence, places where the old map still meant something. Lisbon invested what little it could, building railways to mines and plantations, extending laws written for a continent that had forgotten their authors. For a generation, this illusion held. By the mid-20th century, Europe had begun to shed its colonies. The Second World War had redrawn global power, and new nations demanded sovereignty in the name of the very ideals Europe had preached. Yet Portugal, under the dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, chose another path. To him, the empire was not a remnant, but the reason for existence. He renamed it the Overseas Provinces, declaring them inseparable parts of a single nation, from Minho to Timor. His rule fused austerity, Catholicism, and nostalgia into an ideology of endurance. Lisbon under Salazar was a study in control. The city shone outwardly, but beneath the whitewashed walls lingered silence. Censorship guarded the press. Secret police guarded thought. Propaganda turned the voyages of discovery into liturgy, the cross and caravel into sacred icons. School children learned that Portugal's mission was eternal, that to rule was to serve, that history had not ended, but merely paused. Across the seas, the truth unraveled. In Angola and Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, movements for independence gathered strength. Guerrillas fought in jungles and savannas, their weapons supplied by a new world divided between Cold War powers. Portuguese soldiers, many barely men, were sent to fight wars without purpose in lands their textbooks called brother provinces. The empire consumed its youth. While the wars dragged on, Lisbon stagnated. Isolation grew heavier. Emigration drained villages. Censorship strangled imagination. By the 1970s, a generation born long after the age of discovery had begun to question what remained worth defending. Musicians whispered protest in songs disguised as love ballads. Poets spoke of freedom in parables, and the army itself began to fracture. Officers who had seen too much of Africa carried home the realization that loyalty could no longer mean silence. On April 25th, 1974, their patience broke. Tanks rolled through the streets of Lisbon, but the people did not flee. Crowds gathered, offering red carnations to soldiers who refused to fire. Within hours, the dictatorship collapsed. The revolution was gentle in gesture, immense in consequence. After nearly half a century of repression, Portugal breathed again. The new leaders moved quickly. Censorship abolished, prisoners freed, and, most radical of all, the empire released. One by one, the colonies gained independence. Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, all claimed the sovereignty that Lisbon could no longer deny. The transition was chaotic, marked by exodus and war, but irreversible. The age of empire ended not in battle, but in recognition. Across the oceans, nations that once flew the cross of Portugal now raised their own flags. For the first time in its history, Portugal stood alone within its borders. The seas that had once defined it became symbols rather than frontiers, reminders of both glory and cost. Yet from that contraction came a strange peace. Freed from the burden of empire, the country began to rediscover itself, not as ruler, but as witness. A language, once a tool of dominion, became a bridge linking continents by memory instead of command. Lisbon changed again. The same hills that had watched the caravels depart now overlooked a city of music, books, and returning emigrants. Africans, Brazilians, and islanders settled among its stone alleys, speaking the same tongue with different rhythms. The empire that had dissolved in politics reassembled in culture. Portugal no longer ruled the world, yet the world still spoke its language. Looking back across 8 centuries, the arc seemed impossibly long, from a battlefield in the 12th century to the boulevards of the 20th, from faith forged in war to freedom born in surrender. Few nations had wandered so far and remained themselves. Portugal had touched every ocean and returned smaller, poorer, but more human. Even now, the country carries its history like a pulse. Its sailors' courage, its poets' melancholy, its stubborn endurance, they survive in the rhythm of its speech and the memory of its songs. In the quiet after empire, the nation learned the hardest lesson of all, that discovery does not end when the map is finished, only when curiosity fades. The caravels are gone, their timbers turned to dust, yet their wake still shapes the waters of every shore they reached. From Rio to Goa, from Luanda to Lisbon, the echo of their voyage endures, a reminder that ambition and faith once dared to cross the world, and that even in decline, the dream of Portugal never truly ceased to sail.